I've been threatening to do this for a while, so I'm going to show everybody how we set up our reels, aka our spey rods, our switch rods. And I got a pile of 3 different reels here and a whole bunch of lines and tips and everything else. So I'm going to try to make some sense of what we do. You go online and your server will explode when you put in Spey setups. But this is what we do. It works for us. It's simple, it's flexible. So this is, I'm going to go and just a quick little talk. The other thing is I'm going to do a quick disclaimer here. You're going to see me talk about some different products. We're not being sponsored by anybody. So this is just stuff that we like, that works good for us. So when I mention a certain product company like Reels, Motips, or an Airflow scanning line, it's just that we found that they work good for us. But going forward, this is our setup, this is how we do it, and I'll explain why we do it as we go along. Keep in mind the primary purpose, the way we set stuff up, is to keep things flexible. Alright, starting out with the reel. As you can see, I got one of my beloved Nautiluses here with some backing on it, and this is a smaller reel, so we're going to have a line capacity issue. Probably on the large side for you saltwater fishermen. However, it's got about 150 yards of 30-pound backing in it, which is about my minimum, and I always like 30-pound for these bigger fish. Without going to Spectron or anything else, I do like the little fatter line for trib fishing. So this has already got got around the reel foot here, a large loop into it, so I can easily go over running lines when I put them on. Because of the line capacity issue, I'm probably going to go with some model running line. This happens to be some OPS laser line. It's 50-pound test. I like the heavy stuff. The fatter stuff, it's easy to work with, but keep in mind when you're working with model running line, you're always going to be dealing with a coil in the line. It's usually not a big deal. A cast or 2 takes it out. But it's slippery. It's like handling a grease pig. So you got to keep that in mind, that it's slick. It does shoot very well, but it's just slippery and it's something to get used to. The running lines that I prefer, in this case this is a Rio Connect Core. If I have the line capacity in a room on the larger reels, I prefer to go with a traditional running line. Few reasons. One is it's just a lot easier to handle. It floats. So, but just handling. It doesn't cast as far, but most of our fishing, even with a fat running line, we're going to be overcasting. So it's still not going to be an issue for fishing purposes, and it's a lot easier to handle. And when you get a lot of line out, this stuff will float, and you can kind of helps you handle your line a little better. Where with the mono, it will sink a little bit and it will cut in, but it also cuts through the water nice. But a lot of times what I use mono or I use the traditional fly line style running lines has to do with line capacity on the reel, or if I'm winter fishing or summer fishing. I do like running mono winter fishing. I will touch on that a little bit when I get more into driver heads. Alright, let's talk about putting this together. Now I got another reel here that's all set up. I have a traditional fly line style running line in here, one of those Real Connect cores that I like a lot. And obviously that's been looped, as you saw in the previous reel, onto the reel. The running line is here, and the running line stays on the reel. That's a permanent part of the setup. Then nice little loop-to-loop section. In this case, this horrible tangled mess is a Skagit driver head, and they come anywhere from as short as 15 feet to, I think you still find them 26, 27 feet, but I generally work with them between 18 and 22 feet just to match the rods that I use. But we'll talk about that later. It's looped on with a loop-to-loop here. Now zoom in on it and you can see it. So I got just a very simple loop-to-loop, and then that goes on, and then I'm going to preach this over and over again. Your Skagits are always meant to be fished with some sort of tip. In this case, I got a sinking tip here. It's a green one, so I'm assuming it's probably T8, which is about 8-second sink rate. And then here again, that's looped on the end of the driver head. So basically we have a running line that's looped onto your backing, a driver head that's looped onto the running line, and then your tip that's looped onto the Skagit driver. The real advantage of this is these reels are expensive, and all we need to do is to go from, let's say I'm running a 14-foot 9-weight Spey rod, which is what this line's actually set up for, and I want to put it on a 7-weight switch rod, 11-foot switch rod. All I have to do is take this reel off the Spey rod, unloop this driver head, put on the appropriate driver head and the appropriate tip I want to fish, so my reel is not designated to that rod only. I can move my reels around, and I can also shuffle my driver head. So basically I can, within a few minutes, set a rod up specifically to cast the right lines, the right tips for the conditions, and I can just kind of shuffle everything around. So that's one of the big advantages of this whole system here. Another advantage is, in a previous video we were salmon fishing and one of my reels failed, and a friend of mine had a spare reel so with a running line on, but his driver didn't match. So all I had to do was take his reel, pull off his driver head, put my driver head off the reel that broke, and put his reel back in the rod, and I was back to fishing with a balanced, properly set up rig. And all I had to do was take a few minutes and switch it. Probably the whole switch job took less than 5 minutes, because I was giggling about the fact that the reel broke. So that's the advantage of this multiple line system with different tips looped in, and the loops are very strong. We really have a failure problem. You just kind of keep an eye on them. They start looking a little worn, we just weld new loops on them. So this is the setup right now. I'll show you with a Skagit. Alright, continuing the discussion how we set up reels with different driver heads. In this case I got a reel that I use on one of my switch rods. It's a little smaller, kind of keeps the whole rod balanced and the weight off light. As a result, I've had to go with a mono running line because of reel capacities. And what I did is I used a perfection loop on the running line to then loop in, and here in this horrible mess is a scandy line. But once again, what I did is it's just a loop to loop, and then I just thread on the scandy. A quick note on running mono running lines: if I run my fingers through here, I can feel a little roughness in here. This scandy line setup got a lot of use over a fall that we had a drought fall. So we had a lot of low water conditions, and I love scandies in low water conditions. But the side effect of low water conditions is we were in a lot of rocks, so our running line got beat up. And the nice thing about these things is you usually get like 50 yards. That's 150 feet. That's a lot of line. So when it gets a little beat up on your fishing end, take 10, 15 feet, cut it off, put a new loop, and just keep fishing. But just be moderate, and if it starts looking a little worn, cut it back, put a new loop in it, and because these things are expensive. They can get a little beat up, and after a while, all of a sudden your 50-pound running line has got the break of about 5 pounds, and you lose an expensive driver head or a fish that you worked hard for. So just be mindful of that. But here again, we're looped on with our scandy. Now scandies are a lot longer than Skagits. A lot of our scandies are, I got one right here, that's 33 feet compared to a Skagit setup, which would be 20 feet, and then probably another tip will be at 30 feet. Very often our scandies are 33 feet, drivers on their own, and in this case I got a long leader, and they're meant to be fished with long leaders. 12, 15-foot leaders on a Scandi, if you're running a straight leader system, is really will help you cast a lot better. The other thing is why I like the Rio Airflow Scandis is they will cast these lighter poly leaders. Let the camera catch up with me. I will talk a little bit more about the Scandis, but the Rios, or excuse me, the Scandis will turn over these poly leaders. They won't turn over your heavy sink tips like the Mo tips and that are made with the T stuff, like the T8 or something. They're just too heavy. Even some of the floating tips from Mo, they just don't. They're meant to be either ran with a regular traditional leader or one of these polys. Oops, set that down. But this is basically a Scandi setup. Like I said, in this horrible mess, I use them for low water conditions. I use them when I'm fishing like shallow water, small flies or smaller flies, and I don't want, or when I don't want to get a fly sunk too deep. So this is basically a Scandi setup. Once again, we're off a running line, so we could. I'm going to keep harping on this, the flexibility. You get up in the morning, all of a sudden the water's really low, or you're in a different part of the river and the water's kind of low and the Skagits are hitting too hard. You're not running a heavy tip. It just takes a few minutes. Go to your gear bag, you swap out your Skagit, you put on your Scandi, and you're fishing with a perfectly set up rig for the conditions you're in. One further note on about Scandis. Scandis is a light line. So for an example, if your rod likes a 420 Skagit driver, we also add in the weight of the tip, so you're probably running about 480 for that rod, where that same rod you want to run just a 420 Scandi alone. So your Scandi setups are always a little lighter than your Skagit setups. So basically for casting, what that means is you're going to do more of a touch and go cast, where Skagit you'll be doing a little bit more of a sustained anchor cast. So real easy adjustment. You just got to build a bigger loop and do a touch and go. Scandis are always a little lighter setups. So for, like I said, if you're running tip and everything, a driver head on a Skagit setup and you're about 480, you're going to want to drop back a few grains and go to a little bit lighter on your Scandis. One more passing note about these Scandis. Very often some people show up fishing, all they have is a Scandi setup, river's high and ugly, or we get into a situation, get into a deep pool, and geez, we just need to get down deep. You know, you put on 12 foot of T11 on the end of your Scandi, that fine taper in the front, one, that's not enough, and it's got nice and tangled up here, but it's, you can tell it's kind of fine. The cast is going to collapse. Plus, you just blew your grain window. A little trick that we do, I call it the Emergency Skagit. So you walk into a situation, geez, there's some fish down in a deep pool here, I just can't get down my Scandi. Take your Scandi line, pull it off, and put it on backwards. Now we got the fat end off to the tip end. It'll turn over that T8. The other thing you just got to remember to do is just pull a little bit of your thin end of your Scandi head in. Remember, it's long, so draw some of that into the rod so you get into the little bit fatter part, and she will work as an emergency Skagit setup. And you can get through a quick, oh, whoopsie moment where I forgot my Skagit or whatever, and you can actually make it work quite well by just putting the line on backwards and dealing with a deep water, fast water situation that you might walk into while you're fishing along the river. All right, one last setup I want to talk about, and that's a Spey set or setup I use during the winter. In this case, I definitely like to run, because I do got plenty of room on this reel, I do like to run the Motto running line. The reason for that is one, it doesn't pick up the water and suck the water into the guide, so we don't have the icing problem as much as we do with the more traditional fly line style running line. The other thing here is it's just Skagit driver head. I do use a lot of Skagits during the winter, and this Skagit driver head is actually an intermediate sink. So it'll cut down to the surface, get underneath the water. So if we got high water and you got conversion currents, I call them confused currents, at different speeds, you'll get a cleaner swing. But the other thing this does is it slows my swing down. During the winter, I want to have a very slow, my swing is never slow enough. So I want that fly just coming, creeping across the bottom, hanging in the current, and having all that soft material just swimming. And these intermediate driver Skagit heads, or I call them drivers, but intermediate Skagit heads, even some intermediate Scandi heads, really help slow that swing down. So during the winter, I do run a intermediate just to get it down below the water, slow that swing down. The other advantage, go back to this running line, is that it's light. So when I cast out and I can fish a little shorter, if I need to on really cold days, I can hold the rod tip high and I can carry a lot of this running line out of the water through the swing, and it's not picking up, so that when I reset for the next cast and I strip in, I'm not stripping in wet running line and putting water into my guide tip and cutting down on the icing. So it's light, I can keep a high rod tip, keep it out of the water, and I'm not pulling the swing in to me. So that's the advantage, or the setup that I use during the winter. When you see me winter swinging for steelhead, most certainly this will be the head that I'll be running. All right, I want to make a quick comment on a couple of the driver heads that we use, and then briefly touch on a couple other fly lines that are out there. As I mentioned before, I talked about using the Scandis, and obviously we do use a lot of Skagits because it just turns over our inventory. But there's a third line out here that's called a Rage, and it's kind of comes in between the Skagit and the Scandi. It's kind of a combination of both. It's a little bit longer line. They're generally right around 30 feet, 32, 33 feet, somewhere in there. A lot of guys like them because it just kind of fits the bill of both. They can turn over some reasonably heavy tips. A lot of polys turn over really good. But the other thing is some rods just really like a Rage line, which comes to another whole point. When people ask me, should I be using a 420, should I be using a 450 or a 500 or 520 on my rod? You get a grain window, and you just kind of go within that grain window, and you got to just try a couple lines. There's a lot of experimenting, a lot of trying that goes on. So don't be bashful about asking your buddy to try his line on your rod and see. So there's a lot of experimenting and trial and error has to go on. So that's, like I said, we found a few rods that really like these Rages, and some rods that absolutely don't. You go to try to cast a Rage, and some rods you can hear them almost choke. And of course, same thing with Skagits, or Scandis, excuse me. I got one rod that cast a Skagit okay, but just loves a Scandi. So there's a little bit of experimenting that has to go on. The other thing is I've just talked about shooting heads and driver heads, which often running lines, which is primarily what we do. A lot of other guys like to use full on, complete fly lines like mid belly, long belly lines, which is, what grain window do I use? A lot of times it depends on how far you're casting, how much of that head you're going to have out. So there's a lot more experimenting there. The advantage of going with the traditional double tapers or a mid belly, a long belly, and what I mean by mid belly is how long that weight forward in that fly line is. A long belly is going to be probably 70, 80 feet, and mid belly might be 50, 60 feet. And there again, you're just going to have to experiment, take a look at the grain window of the head, and try it. My suggestion is they're going to run a little lighter than what you think. The advantage of those things is a lot of Atlantic salmon fishermen love them because they can just pick up, cast, there's no stripping. The disadvantage of them is when you have to run a lot of inventory like heavy flies like intruders, hobo spays that are weighted on the flies, or we got to run heavy sinking lines. Those lines don't work too good. Very often our driver heads work a lot better for that. So that's going to be pretty much cover what we do with lines. Like I said, you're going to have to do some experimenting to see what works for you. Now we're going to move on and talk about the tips. Alright, tips. This is where your head can start to explode again. As you can see, I got quite a pile of tips here, and you're going to I always tell everybody when you start out with a floating tip. A lot of these tips here, let me back up here a little bit, are Mo tips from Rio. I like their tips because they're good loops. They're pretty consistent. They come in a bunch of different sizes and lengths and weights, so they're very convenient to work with. We used to make our own. Reel does such a great job. I use a lot of reel tips. But I usually tell everybody to get like a floating, because you always want to have a tip on the end of your Skagits. So a floating, I'm basically talking about running a Skagit head right now. And then get, a lot of these packets come in there, and you look on the bottom here, it'll have the length, and then it says how long it is, and then it'll have the weight. In this case, it'll be titled like T11. And lately they've been color coding the whole tip, which is handy. One of my complaints is it seems like every couple of years they change the whole color coding system, so you end up with multiple color codes in your tips. Like here, you might be able to see this a little bit better. It's purple, that's T11, and in this case the packet says, if you can see it, it says 10 foot, this is T14, 10 foot T14. This is a very aggressive tip. They, as I mentioned before, they got a loop on both ends, so you can loop on, then loop your leader on. When I get done talking about tips, I'll talk briefly about leaders. So you got a whole nest of these things. So I usually tell everybody get a 10 foot T8, a 10 foot T11, and a floating. And if you think you're in heavy water, get 10 foot of T14. That surprisingly covers about 80% of what we're doing. Here's a few of the older ones. They used to color code the end, so you might still find them in the shop once in a while if they have some of the older ones laying around. They're all good. Once again, with the Scandies, and even sometimes in low water conditions with your Skagits, I'll carry a collection of these poly leaders. They are a lot lighter, and they have a sync. They'll have a little sync rate. They'll tell you about how long they are. In this thing, it's got a 5-second. That 24-pound test is the core mono down through the center. The looped on one end, they'll have maybe a mono loop on the other end to put a leader on. These I run a lot with Scandies. I even run with a Skagit sometimes. It just doesn't matter. Now, I didn't talk about before how I like to pick a line and line a rod, and this will be a good point. Very often what I do is I will line my 7/8 and 9s to cast the medium mow tips. Well, that way if I go to a light mow or I go to a heavy mow, in this case a T14, it's easy for me to adjust my casting. So when you go, okay, what tips should I run and everything else, everything's lined from basically a 7-weight rod up to throw the mediums. So I'm in the middle of the road with my tips, so going a little heavier, a little lighter on your tips makes the casting easy.
Define light, medium, and heavy mows as rates of T.
Okay.
Because that's what they are.
Yeah. Dave there just reminded me to give you a rate on here. So as the number of the T goes up, in this case this is T8, this is lighter, T11 is going to be a little bit heavier, and T14 is going to be your heaviest. And there's even in the market now some T20. To give you an idea of the sync rate, that's approximately inches per second. However, what I discovered is it's a little faster than, in this case. I got my hand right here, a packet with they're called their light, they're T8. They want to say probably about 8 seconds an inch a second. It's a little faster than that. So they do dive, especially with these newer systems right here. It's a little thinner, it cuts through the water a little better. I usually add 2 or 3 inches to the second to sink, so they come down pretty fast. So the bigger the number, the heavier the tip. A couple other things here they got going. In this case, you can buy a combination. This is kind of a hybrid. It's got a little bit of floating incorporated in here. This is a 5, and it's got 5 foot of floating, 5 foot of sink. These are really handy in shallow, fast water.
Integrated mows.
Yeah, integrated mows. They work really good. So these are primarily the tips that I use. Now for leaders, and you can see in this little packet here, here in this little mess, I got the leader right on it. For my, when I'm running my sinking leaders and sinking tips, I generally run about a 5 to 6 foot leader. And if you go back into my leader tie-in formula, basically what I do is I take the 30-40 pound butt section, cut it off, put it back in the bag, retie a new leader on it, and take that bottom part, which is going to be about 5-6 feet, and that's what I run for a leader. I do like an integrated leader. It turns over. You can just run 5 foot of, let's say, 12 pound tie your fly on and go fish, but it doesn't turn over well. And if you're casting near brush and trees, you could have a very open floppy loop and put your fly into the trees, where if you have that integrated, you can get a nice tight leader, get underneath the trees, and you're more accurate with your casting. So I generally run about a 5 to 6 foot leader off my sink tips. Now when I'm running my floatings, then I go back to a full length traditional leader. So that's basically my setup with my tips. I tell everybody, get a few tips, go out and fish, start experimenting. As complicated as it may seem, once you start to work with it, it does start to fall into place very quickly. So as much as it seems complicated, it really ain't. You just got to start working with it, start experimenting, and it'll make sense fast. So that basically covers up with my tips. Alright, this is basically what we do to set up our spey rods and our switch rods. And things can be as confusing as this pile of stuff right here in front of me. It's what we do that we found that works good for us. Like I mentioned in the beginning, you can go online, you can look up things on spey fishing, spey casting, spey setups, and your server will melt down. This is our take on it. What works good for us is how we approach it. It's fits our rivers, our style of fishing, and what we do. So hopefully that made some sense. If you have any questions, just leave your questions in the comments. I'll try to answer them. There's a lot more that goes on to this what we showed. This is just a kind of an overview of our setups. So hopefully I answered a bunch of your questions. I made a little bit of sense. And if you have any questions, go down in the comments and leave them in the comments. We'll get to them. As always, hit the little subscribe button there and the bell icon. We got more coming. There'll be a lot more equipment stuff that we'll be talking about, and a lot more fly tying stuff coming in the future. So thanks for watching, folks, and until next time. This is Jay at JPEG Guides and Lost River Fishing. We are a year-round fly fishing catch and release guide service. We fish the Lake Ontario tributaries, and then during the spring and the summer we also fish the inland trout streams, classic dry fly fishing. During the heat of the summer we will do the warm water fishing for bass and pike. If you're interested in any of our outings or have any questions, please feel free to email us at fish@lostriversfishing.com. Hope to hear from you, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact us.